So I'm going to talk about an economy of land, sort of moving to quite a substantial scale. Given the definitions of economy, which Pritchard has explained, in particular in relating to the household, but also as an activity of management, I'd like to share a very specific architectural urban design in which economy is really playing an active role. In this work, what might be called an economy of land relates management of a landscape between the scale of an individual dwelling and the scale of a region. This economy of land is quite embedded and really an active force in the design research in what I have come to call as a project bastide city territory. It's a live work and a kind of continuum of historical research and design projection. The project formed the basis of my PhD by practice. Terrain vague is a term commonly applied to areas of sprawl and was coined to describe an extension of the precisely limited ground fit for construction for the city. As declining agricultural production has opened up flat sites suited to construction and mobility and communication continue to strengthen, fit for construction extends everywhere. I find it really interesting, and perhaps in the context of our thinking about economy, that this term terrain vague can also be translated as wasteland. I'm really interested in the question of how to work with the tendency towards urban dissolution, which seems to express a really popular aspiration. I find there's a real pathos in this disconnect that exists. The project is also, as well as being a live project, is intended as a provocation to the current inertia in Monpazier. So this is a photograph of an exhibition we held in the town, me and my translator, Sophie, talking with one of the local politicians, and a publication of it. I'm going to begin by talking about economies of scale and the origins. Given the blanket of suburbanity spreading indiscriminately across Europe and much of the world, I'm hoping to show how the bastides of Southwest France can offer important lessons to urban designers and architects interested in addressing this urban morphology. This is a bastide, Monpazier in particular, and it's defined as a bastide by the fact that it was a novel town, a completely new town, founded on previously unsettled land. Equally sized building plots were set within a grid plan of streets with a really strict hierarchy of routes. So longitudinal streets, in this case 8 meters wide, transverse streets running in the shorter dimension of the town, in this case 6 meters wide, and then within the blocks of the town, these smaller passageways where normal life could continue on market day in the town. And at the center of the town is the market square, which is really stressing the economic role of these towns. It's often surrounded by an arcade, and it's really substantial, in this case 40 by 46 meters, with the church always, and this was quite new at this time, during the Middle Ages, the church always occupying this secondary position in relation to the market square, just to remind you that the purpose of this town is primarily economic. And these towns were founded by European leaders warring over this area of Southwest France. So they're turning their attention back on places closer to home following the Crusades, but also bringing some really clear ideas, such as these cornières, this corner entrance into the center of the market square, where you really see the full scale of the square. These towns resulted from a rapid program of settlement by both French and English powers of what at the time was mainly forested landscape. Those which remain, some 200 or so, are clearly focused on this area cleared of forest. This is the sort of bridge of land at the very bottom of France, and you can see just where Spain begins. They now leave this network of towns with populations of between 500 and 2,000, sort of focusing agricultural activity within this region. The town's foundation is particularly interesting. So the town was laid out by a surveyor on the ground at the order of the power in the region. So the town was laid out with a strict sort of equal division of plots. Each plot is the same size, but at the same time as the plot within the town for building a dwelling, there was also a plot within the perimeter of the town for a vegetable garden, and then an area of land in the broader surrounds of the town for cultivation. So really it's a kind of economic machine for exploiting the resources of this territory. And it becomes particularly interesting once you start looking at regions of bastides. So this is the particular region within which Monpazier sits. And you can see Bergerac here, sort of much further west is Bordeaux on the coast. And there's something to me about this area of land here, which really, you can see that there's something particularly special about the land in this area. Within regions like this Aquitaine region, bastides are actually incredibly equally distributed across the landscape. So when you drive from one to the next, it always seems to be the same distance. And this is because it's a way of, it allowed people to walk from one bastide to the next and back again in a day. And just to sort of explain a little about the French and English at this time. So this is this region, and there's a series of French towns founded by Alphonse de Poitiers, followed by a series of English towns founded by Edward I. So the French towns, and sometimes these bastides grow into larger towns around, but you can still see the bastide at the center. Tournon, Castillonnez, Villefranche, Villarreal, Montflacin, La Linde. And then these are the English towns, so Beaumont, Molière. And the English towns are all forming a network of trade for export, bringing a lot of wine, actually, to the south coast of England. So this is Winchelsea on the south coast of England, part of the same programme of development. The consistency of the block geometry and the urban pattern and their seriality allows the grid plan of the town to act something like a kind of control in a scientific trial. These towns really reveal the variability and intense specificity of different places. So to return quickly to Siegel, so among this group, Monpazier is regarded as an exemplary bastide. You find it in an enormous number of architectural texts, always repeating the same diagram, showing its individual lots, each 8 by 20 meters, its market square, the church. And here is the bastide itself, seen from the northwest. And you can see that actually 800 years of subsequent construction and reconstruction, adaptation, reuse, reconfiguration mean there's an infinite variety in the kinds of houses and the development of houses within the town. Creating throughout this town an experience of this quite gentle urbanity, but always in this profoundly rural context. The local economy and Dordogne, in the particular region in which Monpazier is located, is really an agricultural economy. There are vineyards focused around Bergerac, but across Dordogne. The town has an incredible infrastructure of markets, all still held on the same day across all of these bastides, markets in which live animals are brought straight into town. Produce of the land includes ceps and chestnuts, really the kind of everything you think about in terms of sort of gastronomic excellence, really excels in the Dordogne, foie gras. This is Monpazier in 1950. its north is oriented to the left. And in spite of this agricultural richness, which like other places is declining, but not at such a rate, it remains an agricultural department. The growth of Monpazier is quite astonishing, especially when paired with the fact that the town's population has depleted from around 2,000 to 500 people. This is the town now, and there's this paradox between this kind of emptying out of the centre of the town itself and this growth within the landscape. This is a derelict property within the town. Cultural life of the town as a result has become focused on kind of events for tourists and for quite a sort of affluent retired European community of residents. This is a classic car show in the centre of town. The place that this expansion is happening is this landscape north of the town. It's a really intricate, quite beautiful landscape with these very long straight paths. And it feels almost like the settlement of Monpazier surrounding landscape will continue. There's a total absence of any local strategy in relation to this landscape. Bastide's economic purpose meant that, that it put in place this system of differentiated land use. And this tends to be different for each bastide, but in the case of Monpazier, it's been found that one can relate specific areas to this form of settlement. So you see here the house, the garden, but also the 8 hectares of land for cultivation and the 12 hectares of forest for fuel or for construction. And you can still see these areas when you look at an aerial plan of the town. So you can, the vegetable gardens themselves, some of which are sort of just used as gardens, some small sort of allotments, but also the strip pattern of the farms and also these areas of forest. And what that actually means at a kind of regional scale is that when you understand all of these areas for the 300 lots allocated within Monpazier, there is this associated territory. And this territory, when you look at it on a geological map, has this incredible division between this plateau landscape of limestone to the north. Monpazier is sitting on this promontory hanging over the river valley, and then this area of sedimentary ground to the sort of south and east, which is more forested. These obviously are good for growing different kinds of things, but the kind of split between them is quite amazing. And when you get to the edge of this, you would be at the edge of the next bastide, and so on across the region. I think one of the things that I find really interesting about this territory and about thinking about territory in relation to urbanity is its potential to act as a kind of a form of restraint. So from this book, Stuart Alden's The Birth of Territory, he picks out this quote from More's Utopia, in which he describes why, from the perspective of cultivators, a city would not want to enlarge its boundary. This is an image by an American who visited Europe after the big Dust Bowl events in the States, during which sort of agricultural farming methods had really almost destroyed vast landscapes for production. And this Dr. W.C. Loudermilk was sent to France and sent to other parts of Europe to study agricultural methods for preserving landscape during the process of cultivation. So here, you know, he has some incredible photographs of terraces and some very dramatic landscapes. This is by far the most subtle, and this is showing these French farmers, actually in southwest France, and they're loading soil from the lowest furrow of their field because they understand the process of soil erosion means that they need to gather nutrients from the bottom and bring them back up to the top. And they're doing this manually. And I guess much the same as within the town, actually I wanted to say that, over 800 years, the landscape surrounding Monpazier will have been subject to the same kind of construction and reconstruction and adaptation and reuse and reconfiguration to make it work better, just like the town, or even to make it continue to work at all. There's a kind of infinite variety in the way that people rebuild landscapes, and what results is really a cultural landscape that's intricate in its hedgerow, paths, ditches, bearing witness to the immense effort and knowledge embedded in such terroir. The term cultural landscape Adorno used to describe the work of humanity embodied in historic settlements, historic villages like Monpazier, can be more broadly considered as comprised of town and territory, i.e. all the work involved in settling land, embodying what Luigi Snozzi calls the memories of the value of human efforts. In any economy, it seems really important to question what has value, and if in the case it is land, what is it we value about it? This is a photograph looking back to Monpazier from a slope about 20 meters above it, sort of diagonally looking at the town, and it seems almost as if it's been sort of superimposed on this forested landscape. I haven't altered this photograph, but the plateau means it sort of stands out against this backdrop of forest. And you can really see the town situated within the region, and on the horizon, actually, the local baron, the local kind of big chief. Here is that slope, and from it, this ridge extends in this kind of quite dynamic relation to the promontory on which the town sits. You can see the grid of the town here. And this is really the focus of the work that I've been doing for the PhD. Looking at this landscape, and you can see in the photographs, these stripped fields that run across it are divided into bands which run north-south from the town. And there's almost a condition in which this landscape is kind of like a sort of macro version of this town. It has its own kind of looser grid, these long north-south bands of hedgerow and paths, extending all the way to the forest line, which you can just gather here. It's the kind of furthest extent. And then these sort of white areas are where cultivation has ceased to occur across this landscape. And these tend to be the areas that are then sold and redeveloped. This is a drawing looking at those sort of bands and really the quite amazing longitudinal rhythm that they give to this landscape. It already has its own kind of structure in place. And from that study, there emerged this idea of the bastide city territory. And one of the key parts of that was to introduce a new layer following the principles of landscape infrastructure design. And that new layer would be this series of east-west concentrated settlements, which I called cones. And these are considered as a kind of expansion of Monpazier, structured in relation to this landscape. The architecture of these cones is intended to unify disparate and non-vernacular construction in the territory. They're proposed as a kind of inclined earthwork which sits along which sits a new artificial ground articulated as fields of different materials and planting. They're designated areas for construction. And between them, preserved open spaces for cultivation. This is a series of sort of spatial precedents I used to develop the idea of these cones. So really thinking about these concentrations as a territorial scale element, and this sculpture by Carl Andre really using a very simple repeated form in the case of these steel tiles, but actually making this kind of composition within the gallery where each adopts different postures. These direct lines cutting through the land by Richard Serra, again highlighting through the simplicity of that form just the different sort of inflections in this slope, in this ground. And then here these coastal barriers which prevent longshore drift, really a simple repeated form, a structure which can stabilize a terrain. And part of the idea of infrastructure really is that, that the approach recognizes that design is one part of a process, an ongoing process of city making, and that a total work or master planning, etc., is not what's needed. But instead the question is how to provide a cohesive structure for future unknown development, extending from the bastide. How this occurred was studied through a series of sketches, looking at the depth of these combs and how they could allow and host a diversity of different building types across them, with cultivation either side. How a tapestry of different activities could occur along a comb as it developed over time. How the combs could be deep enough, they're sort of 78 meters deep, in order to create an urban square enclosed by buildings along their perimeter. How they could slide between existing elements in the landscape, so in this case a cemetery to the north of the town. And so across Monpazier's landscape, and this very rough sketch just tries to picture the four combs. Monpazier itself, there's a plantation of walnuts, walnut trees, and the kind of broad overarching horizon of the forest, all becoming these different elements playing together within this broader field. There's an essay by Kenneth Frampton on megaform, in which he describes the qualities of a megaform as a large form extending horizontally rather than vertically, capable of inflecting an existing landscape as found because of its strong topographical character, and at the same time insinuating itself as a continuation of the surrounding topography. And this is a model made to show these combs, but also all of the other the forest line and the hedgerow across this landscape, with the bastide on its promontory here. So I think, as I described before, but at present the residential development that's occurring is resulting for the most part from the sale of one or two fields. That's divided into garden plots, and then a single-storey house is constructed in the centre. It's very, very different to the historic model, obviously. There's not so much architectural imagination among the houses that are being built, but there's a kind of seriality here, and a repetition that suggests there's some basis for a collective agreement. The spatial condition offered by the comb is also suggestive. This is a photograph of a quite large model, which looks at the first of these combs in relation to the bastide itself, and examines how, located along the edge of one of the combs, these houses might enjoy a more immediate, more compelling relationship to the landscape. And so thinking about ways in which this existing model could be translated, really the garden area of the existing settlement becomes part of the cultivated land room between combs. The aim is to safeguard adaptability by maintaining a more or less equal plot size along the edges of combs. If houses had the potential to start smaller and grow over time, they might attract a more diverse mix. At present, in the communes of Marsalis and Capdrot, the neighbouring communes to Monpazier, 75% of the houses have 4 or more bedrooms. It's the same in Monpazier, really substantial houses. The idea of this, in economic terms, is to separate the constructible area of land from the garden. At present, the entire area of a suburban house is classified as constructible, and it's therefore 10 times the value of agricultural land. So a simple calculation within the thesis shows that this could actually bring a house within the financial reach of a couple on the average income in Monpazier. At the average rate of construction in this landscape at the moment, only 60 dwellings would be constructed over the next 30 years. There are 32 hectares, however, of inactive land across the territory, and around 1/5 is proposed as constructible, so part of the combes, with shares equivalent to the present average garden area, however. It could be that, that the advantage of reinvigorating the territory as an idea makes it possible to consider the longer term distribution of land as a resource for both development and cultivation. I think it's well understood that there's a disconnect between the current Western European diet and the amount of cultivatable land globally per person, but the fact that significant changes to existing models of food production, distribution and consumption are undoubtedly required is not yet fully recognised. So this thesis proposes territory as the basis for a more proportional relationship between areas of building and agricultural land, which could take place from the ground up. If land shares in areas of new cultivation was set at around 1,000 metres square per person, some relationship between settlement and arable land might be established. This could result in the distribution of around 88% of the inactive area identified. Increasing the area of land in private ownership by residents might appear counterintuitive, but would safeguard inactive land from development. In the more immediate future, this land could be leased both for cultivation of vines and orchards, thereby creating a landscape with its own appeal to settlement. Through this project for a specific site, this thesis is building on an earlier approach to the diffuse city and a key direction in the cultural endeavour of city making, which suggests agricultural landscape as a formative and structuring element to define and delimit a diffused form of urbanity. Ludwig Hilbersheimer's new regional pattern, industries and gardens, workshops and farms, was a design for a unit of land self-containing by reasons of geographical advantages, natural resources and soil conditions, natural and man-made transportation routes developed and used by its population. He proposed these settlement units, and also proposed that the task of planning was a case of designing a site size and layout in accordance with the specific characteristics of a region. The need to structure urban growth really determined its key principles. Human scale and walkability were one. The distance from the farthest house to the working area nowhere exceeds 15 to 20 minutes of walking time. And another was balanced production. A region should produce and consume for itself as much of the things it needs as possible, importing nothing it might itself produce. A third was that community and individual would have an equitable share in the landscape so that an organic regional life could be created. Although the site of this landscape infrastructure design stretches quite far from Monpazier, the thesis is drawing quite specifically and quite deeply on its spatial constitution. Using this simple geometric form, repeatedly giving structure to a larger place, using spatial gestures already present in the landscape, and adopting those as a formative measure. It also seeks, through this emblematic condition of Monpazier, this quite extraordinary value that this town has, to engage with and offer up new innovations for making a diffuse city more generally. Bastide city territory is an architectural urban design strategy for Monpazier's expansion to occur through managing the relativity of different parts towards something in which the scale corresponds with the meaning and the value of the parts. The lessons of the bastide for contemporary urbanism lie in the three essential principles of the bastide: its efficiency, the fact that it's agreeable to different parts of the population, and the fact that it's open-ended. Each is essential to the architectural character of the bastide and its value as a form of city management. They underpin both the innovative nature of the bastide as a model of urbanity and the landscape infrastructure design. So an economy of land might mean establishing the principles of management to govern ongoing relationships between urban, agricultural, and other elements.